It is afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not a microbiologist. I'm not a vet, but I have been milking sheep for a long time, and mastitis is something that's come into my area of interest. I talked to you last year about mastitis, and I'm just going to give you some more thoughts. I've been doing some background research into hill country sheep. We haven't done anything as yet in dairy sheep, but I've got a small amount of money. I'm going to be having an intern come and do some work with me for 6 months on Sandy Shivis's farm, so hopefully next year we'll be able to tell you a bit more about mastitis in dairy sheep. Just a little bit of a very quick background. Back in the 70s and 80s, Quinlivan and Clark looked at mastitis in our hill country sheep, and they discovered a very low incidence. Thank you. So only about 1 to 2%, and that's probably why no one took any more notice about the incidence or prevalence of mastitis. However, I reported to you last year that my studies of one massive farm of about 1,800 ewes, we found 5% of ewes a month to 2 months after drying off, which had mastitis. But we still have no published data, to my knowledge anyway, on the prevalence of mastitis in dairy sheep in New Zealand. If you look at the international data, you'll find that Contreras said that less than 5% of dairy sheep had proper mastitis, and recently had a visit from Gilles Lagrefou, who introduced me to some French language literature reports which are not really available, and so I had to practice update my school French and go do some reading. But basically 2 to 3% is what they expect or what they find in France. What I was most interested in, though, or what is starting to interest me, is the species that are present. And in the first 30 days, the species that are present in the milk of dairy sheep, Staphylococcus aureus, coagulase negative Staphylococcus aureus, Streptococcus, Pasteurella, and Enterobacteriaceae. And this is from France, and here's the point: these animals have got their lambs with them for the first 30 days. And I've been wondering for a long time about the importance of the lamb and its mouth and the bacteria that are there. This diagram shows, if I can find the right, whoops, no, that's what everyone else has been doing. How do I avoid that? So over here, 0 to 15, and days 16 to 30, we can see that the bacteria here are Staph aureus, Staphylococcus coagulase negative, Streptococci, Pasteurella, and Enterobacteria. But we can see that after the lamb goes, all the others drop off, and we're left mainly with Staph aureus. So the first message here is we've got a whole bunch of bacteria in the mouths of lambs, presumably, which may be contributing to the bacteria that are in the milk and in the udder of the mother. This diagram shows similar things. This is actually now showing the cause of mastitis at the start of mastitis. So the translation at the top is the frequency of germs at the start of non-specific mastitis. The green ones are hyperacute to subacute mastitis, and the pink ones are chronic mastitis. So again, we can see that this period, that Staph aureus and the other bacteria that we were talking about before are the major organisms that are present at the start of an outbreak of mastitis in an individual. So what I'm really getting at is that lambs may be a significant source of mastitis bacteria. I can't find a paper which has analysed that. I've only found it in humans. So one paper showed that nasal carriage of Staph aureus in the baby has been implicated in mastitis in women. But I think that needs some work to be done, especially if we're going to use the mixed strategy if we're going to leave the lambs with the ewes in our sheep dairy industry. The main species that we're going to find is usually Staph aureus, but I just want to point out that it's not the same strain of Staph aureus as you'll find in dairy cows. So same species, but different strains with different degrees of infectiveness. In Italy, just to be different, they're saying that it's coagulase negative staphylococci, which is their main cause or their main species present. The other point is that Staph aureus can transfer or spread to a neighbouring gland. And it may be that the neighbouring gland has subclinical mastitis, while one gland can have clinical mastitis and the other one may have subclinical. Just a warning or reminder that trematode infections and pregnancy toxemia, so some other things that happen to animals that reduce the effectiveness of their immune systems, can predispose them to mastitis. So that's just some thoughts about mastitis. And in particular, as I say, I'm really keen to find out more about the effect of the bacteria that are present in the lamb's mouth. Subclinical mastitis, we've been talking about that for years in the dairy cow. It's very hard to find a value for somatic cell count which is really, truly accepted as indicative of being a limit for subclinical mastitis. So last year I reviewed a lot of papers and I came up with a value of 250,000 counts per mil as being probably the most accepted value, but Berthelot et al. Insist that it's twice that. And so we've got this problem, we've got a tool, but we've got these really vague boundaries on how to use it. And Berthelot et al. Said that 1 million was indicative of clinical mastitis. What we also need to realise is that if you've been thinking about mastitis and somatic cell count in terms of dairy cow numbers, you need to rethink, because sheep have very much larger numbers. So somatic cell counts, I've seen several in excess of 5 million in my little studies, and one of those animals had no detectable signs of mastitis. It was one of my control animals. So, you know, there can be some very big numbers there. Also remember that the bulk tank is a different category. It's a different way of thinking. You can't use the same numbers that you would use for individuals in relation to the bulk tank. So if your somatic cell count, this is Begonia et al., 2006, they said that if your somatic cell count in your bulk milk is 100,000, then you've got 3% of your ewes infected with subclinical mastitis. If it's 500,000, you've got 10 to 12. But going back, if we were to look at individual animals and look at their somatic cell counts, it could be that animals with 100,000 are fine, and it could be that some animals with 1 million are fine. Less likely, but possible. So if we were to, use selection, that would be a problem. We have seen international data which shows that subclinical mastitis can reduce milk yield by 50% and alter, or in particular, reduce the proportions of milk, fat, protein, lactose, and particularly casein. The international data shows that selecting for lower somatic cell count will generally improve the mastitis status of your flock, but there will be individuals which will not fit into that category. You're going to find individuals that have high somatic cell counts, but if you're able to analyse them more carefully, you'll discover they don't actually have mastitis or subclinical mastitis. One suggestion is that it's a previous infection that has kicked off their immune system, so the somatic cell counts have gone up and stayed up, or there may be other environmental factors that are involved in that. And one of the things that I'm fairly convinced of is that there is seasonal variation with photoperiod, so you'll expect to see somatic cell counts change and particularly be higher in the autumn. So that's my reflections on somatic cell count. The next one is hard udder, and this is where I started. I noticed in my lactation trials over many years, I noticed sheep arriving in the first week after lambing with a hard udder, just like a piece of wood, woody udder or hard udder, and you can't express any milk from it. And if you're a lactational physiologist, that animal is no use to you, so you send it back to the farm. I didn't know what it was for years and years. But looking back over my data, 5% of animals presented with hard udder. You can't see it from looking. Well, maybe some people can, but I can't. You really need to feel it, but as soon as you feel it, you know what it is. You put your hand on the udder, it's as hard as a rock. Bruce et al. In 2013 reported on this condition in 13 years. This is actually what it looks like, and it's very hard for you to see anything there. But what I want you to see is that my finger is inserted in a groove, and that groove effectively goes right around there. It's like there's a disc or a discus under the skin, and you can put your fingers under the edge of it, but that whole area in this animal was one solid lump. If you feel the teat, if you revolve it in your fingers, you will feel like a stick in the teat canal. And it's very likely that that teat canal is actually blocked. So what Bruce et al. Found in their 13 animals, 8 teats were occluded, that is completely blocked and inflamed. 7 with ducts inside were occluded and inflamed. 5 had mammary gland atrophy and fibrosis, that's the growth of connective tissue, and 7 of them just had chronic mastitis, big infections. So what they concluded was that this condition doesn't resolve. You can't identify it easily. You need to include it in your examinations, but why has it not been seen more often? Why have we not heard a lot more about this disease? And my suggestion is that it disappears. So I had the luck or misfortune to have one of my ewes give birth on the 15th of November with triplets. One of them was mental and had to be put down basically, but the rest, the 2 lambs stayed on. Hard odour, no doubt about it, was very well defined. It covered a large area, there was no milk. On the 11th of December, so pretty much 1 month later, the size of that hard udder area was reduced, and my colleague Adrian Molnar here came and scanned it. And what his scan shows is that on this side you can see normal looking tissue, and over here a quite different, smaller area that's effective. And from this angle we can see the cistern with milk in it, and on this side the cistern is just not present. So what's going on? Oh, sorry. Subsequent to that, a month later, the hard area was now down to the size of my palm, and by a month later after that, there's no palpable sign of this condition. But the damage, I'm sure, is in there. What's happening, I believe, is that this is a normal looking udder, but in here we're getting all of these parts blocked up. We're getting infection which causes the growth of connective tissue which blocks up ducts, which causes the milk to be trapped, and that's what makes it feel hard. Over time, over 3 months, the milk disappears, is reabsorbed, and it feels soft again. But the damage is still there. So what I'm going to find out from my ewe number 9 is next spring, will that gland operate at all? And if it does, will it be hard udder? I don't expect to ever see milk come from that gland again. So, we've got no published data on mastitis in New Zealand. I think that's about to change because Andy Greer at Lincoln University has submitted a paper for New Zealand Society of Animal Production this year, so we'll get some of our first data. What I do believe is that you're going to find pretty much 5% of animals with mastitis whenever you look. And so if you look early, you might find hard udder. If you look in the middle of lactation, you'll find a different kind of mastitis. And if you look after lactation, you'll find another one. Lambs may carry mastitis organisms, well worth considering. We really need to find out what's going on in dairy ewes, and as I say, I hope to find out in association with Sandy Shivers and my intern a bit more about that next spring. In the meantime, good hygiene, teat sprays after milking, all the good things that we've learned from dairy cow people. Use antibiotics in the dry period if you've got a bad case, and use all the other testing mechanisms you can to identify animals that are not so good. Just one final pitch. There's a new textbook in sheep production available. Myself and several other people at Massey have got chapters in it, so I've written a chapter on sheep lactation. There's a flyer for it on the table down the back. That's my shameless promotion. Thank you.